name's John Edgar. I'm on the board, and I want to thank you as well for coming out tonight. We are proud to offer tonight's program, which is the third program in a series of 8 programs that we are offering to help commemorate the town's 250th anniversary of our incorporation. We're celebrating the town's 250th anniversary of our incorporation, and so tonight's program is one of 8 programs that we've set out to help emphasize the town's history as part of that celebration. We would like to thank the Meredith Village Savings Bank. They are our prime sponsor for the program series, and without their support, this would not have been possible. Tonight's program is entitled The Cultural Landscape and Museum of Local History, and we have a tag team tonight, a little bit of a departure from our first 2 programs. Our tag team members are Jim Garvin and May Williams. Jim earned a doctorate degree in American Studies from BU in 1983. He served for 24 years as the New Hampshire State Architectural Historian with the Division of Historical Resources in Concord. Prior to that, Jim served as curator of Strawberry Bank, the Portsmouth Athenaeum, and the New Hampshire Historical Society. Jim is the author of a book entitled A Building History of Northern New England, and has co-authored books on early New Hampshire taverns, travel, furniture, and hand tools. Jim is currently an adjunct faculty member at Plymouth State University. May has a Master's of Arts in Historic Preservation from Plymouth State University. After receiving her secondary degree, she combined her love of history, architecture, and environmental conservation into a career in historic preservation. In 2014, May opened up her own business as an independent preservation consultant and architectural historian, and works out of an office in Center Harbor. I wanted to mention that this year May completed a study for the Center Harbor Heritage Commission. This study identifies, which is our neighbor to the east, if you're not aware of that. The study identifies many of Center Harbor's historic resources and discusses how they can be preserved for the enjoyment of future generations by helping to define historical and cultural resources as an aspect of community character, informing decisions around land use applications and policies, and as well as educating the public about the overall importance of preserving a community's historical and cultural heritage. So we're incredibly fortunate to have both Jim and May with us tonight. Before we get started with the program, just one last item of business. We do need to do the Pledge of Allegiance, as is the custom of the Historical Society, so if you could please stand and join. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much for having us here tonight as part of the 250th celebration. It's a real honor to be here. Yep. So what do stone walls and foundations for a forest tell us about our ancestors? The purpose of our talk here tonight is to kind of give you a little bit of information on how to read the landscape to better understand our local history. Once a few trends in our regional, state, and local history are understood, you can key those into local landmarks that you see and site features to better understand local events, whether they're things in your own backyard or things in the Page Pond Forest, which we're going to kind of focus in on. Jim's going to talk a little bit about more general trends, and I'm going to try to tie those into the more local examples throughout the talk. So, and also, what we're talking about, we're focusing on Meredith, but a lot of these concepts are pretty much anywhere throughout the state. Hand it over to Jim.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Many of you were here a month ago when Brian Burford spoke about the Masonian proprietors and the origins of land layout and planning in New Hampshire. And I want to go back over a little bit of that. I know it's very technical, but on the other hand, I think it's important to understand that what Brian described about a month ago, the way of dividing land and granting it, created a grid in the landscape And that grid is still here, it's still visible. Here we have fresh batteries. We'll see. Don't count on it. It seems to wear out quickly. But anyway, we'll give it a try. The grid that's created by this method of planning, I'll go into this in just a few minutes here, is still visible. And I'm going to show you a new technology tonight. Dave and I are going to show you a new technology that will make it easier to actually see that grid. When you have the visibility of the grid made clear, then any particular spot in the landscape, including an area, say, around Page Pond here in Meredith, fits into a visible history that otherwise would be invisible. And so what we basically have here is a way of linking the first layout of this part of New Hampshire to today's history. And in seeing some of what May just described, the landscape itself becomes kind of a textbook or a museum of local history. And that is what we basically want to emphasize tonight. I want to show you on this little map that you see on the screen the origin of New Hampshire as it was in 1629. You can, I hope, see this little border circle down in the bottom of that map. That was the grant that was given to Captain John Mason in 1629 by a group of speculators in England who were called the Council for Plymouth. And Brian went over this last week, and so I'm not going to really recapitulate it, but this essentially was a private grant to a single individual, John Mason, and a partner of John Mason's, a man named Ferdinando Gorges, received a similar grant, but bigger, and that was the grant of Maine, which is this parallelogram that you can see to the right of New Hampshire. So what we have in New Hampshire is a private holding that later became incorporated into a publicly created province or colony under the crown, under the king. But this private grant, this private property that was given to a single individual is going to come back and back in our history, and we're going to see it even today in the landscape and topography of Meredith. There we go. I have to have a powerful grip to make this thing work. Now this map it's the same map, right and left, but you're seeing a close-up on the right. This is the Blanchard-Langdon map of 1761, which was the first detailed map ever created of New Hampshire. And it is pretty good. It's pretty detailed. Many of the town names are different from what they presently are, but the topography and the river layouts and all of those things is fairly close to what we still would recognize today. But on this map, as you can see it particularly on the left-hand version, I've outlined or retraced what is actually on the map itself, and that is that quarter circle, the Masonian grant, the grant to Captain John Mason. Now, by the time this map was created in 1761, New Hampshire had become a royal province. It was governed by the Crown, the Privy Council, and the King in England, with a royal governor in Portsmouth, a man named Benning Wentworth. But within that province, there was still this questionable area that had originally been private property, and that is everything inside that quarter circle. If you take a look at the right-hand map on this is a close-up or a detail of the left-hand full map. You can see a portion of that arc, and it runs right through a thing called Cassumpy Pond, which we would recognize today as Squam Lake. And you can see the Meredith area right below that, and Misaki shown fairly clearly. Everything south or inside that circle was subject to private property claims, which remained more or less dormant until the 1740s, when they were revived and became a matrix on which a town like Meredith and all the other towns within that circle were actually granted. Now I see that the battery cover on this thing is coming loose. That's a technical issue. Now, here is an example of the way in which towns within that arc were laid out. In 1746, a group of 12 people in Portsmouth purchased from the Mason family, the descendants of Captain John Mason, Mason's private claim to New Hampshire. That was something like 12 million acres, or 2.5 million acres. It was a tremendous tract of land. It fell within that circle. And that created a tremendous furor because the province of New Hampshire, the royal governor, was talking about purchasing this for public purposes and regranting under government auspices. But when a group of private investors purchased it, that threw that whole plan off. The private investors were shrewd. They were all merchants in Portsmouth, and they all understood politics and society in New Hampshire at that time. So they immediately quit-claimed to anybody who had a land title in New Hampshire up to that point, that title, and it basically gave them legitimacy in whatever land holdings they already had acquired. So that removed any threat that the new proprietors, who call themselves the Masonian proprietors, were going to take away your land if you already had some land that had been granted to you. That allayed all the fears of the public, and pretty soon, very quickly actually, people began to turn to the Masonian proprietors and say, you have this huge tract of land out beyond the frontiers of our existing settlements. We would like a town. We would like to have a township granted to us. And that basically happened right here in Meredith. The way in which these proprietors granted a township, however, was what you see on the screen. When they could do it ideally, and when they didn't have things like Meredith Bay and other obstructions in the way, they basically laid out a rectangle or a parallelogram like the thing you see on the screen. This is actually the original proprietor's map of Henniker, New Hampshire. And the way in which they laid it out was, as you can see, it's like a checkerboard. It's a series of rectangular lots, all divided by what are called range roads, which were access roads or pathways between the various lots, and cross-range roads, which run at right angles. This provided a perfect grid, and it also allowed the granting of these lots in equal way to the people who were petitioning to be proprietors. And in order to be really fair, the Masonian proprietors would grant quite often 2 or 3 lots within the township to any one individual. So if you got a lot that might have been on the top of a rocky mountain, or maybe out in Meredith Bay, then you'd be compensated with a lot that was on dry land, or maybe had cultivable land, cultivable soil. The other thing that's interesting about this map, and I understand this is true of one of the maps of Meredith in the 1700s, is that each corner of each lot is defined by a tree. And that tree is designated by a symbol. And that symbol is defined in a key to this map. Now that has become very important to ecologists and people who are trying to study the natural history of New Hampshire, because by figuring out in this sort of random grid that's laid across the landscape what trees appear at each corner of each lot, people nowadays can get an idea of what the natural forest was like at the time of settlement. What proportion of white oaks you had to red oaks, what proportion of beech you had to maples, and so forth. And this has become ecologically very significant. So we've learned a lot from this seemingly mechanistic kind of land layout. I'll let May take over.
So this is the background in which Meredith was formed. So in these early 1700s, a petition was made by Jonathan Longfellow and 59 others to King George II for some land, but it was actually within the Masonian proprietorship. So that land was granted on December 31st, 1748, by the Masonian proprietors to that group of men, and named Palmerstown. Palmerstown was named after Samuel Palmer, who was one of those grantees from Hampton, New Hampshire. He was also a teacher of surveying and navigation, and laid out much of the area around Lake Winnipesaukee. So at the time, Palmerstown stretched all the way from the Winnipesaukee River all the way up to what would eventually become the border with Santa Harbor. Santa Harbor wasn't there yet. It was surveyed first in 1750 to 1753 into 95-acre lots in 3 divisions. So, like Jim said, not regular shapes because there's way too much water. And there were a bunch of conditions that the Masonian proprietors made on the way those lots were laid out. They wanted 100 shares, and they wanted 2 lots each, and they wanted everything to be surveyed within so many years. So there was a lot to that. And then also one of the other things was that 6 acres be reserved for public purposes, building a meeting house, a school, a training field, and a burial ground. And they chose to do that in what they saw as the geographical center of town, which you can see, yeah, thank you, Jim. You can see right there, which is actually on Parade Road in what is now Laconia. So not in Meredith anymore, but that was the first settlement, really. And then lots were drawn in 1754, and most were sold to men. Oh, no, computer?
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Brad. Mostly sold to men who planned to settle and farm, but settlement in the interior of New Hampshire didn't happen quite then. Most of interior New Hampshire didn't get settled until after the French and Indian War ended, so after about 1763. So early settlement in Meredith was about 1766, mostly from people from Salem, Massachusetts, and at that point, Palmerstown was renamed New Salem. So the town of Meredith was incorporated on December 21st, 1768 by Governor John Wentworth. It was named after William Meredith, the 3rd Baronet, and a member of the British Parliament. It was also resurveyed shortly after that in 1770. And you can see in this map from 1784, by that time you have this big long road that goes north-south. That was the province road that went all the way from Portsmouth up to Canada, and was laid out in about 1763. And then also on this map you can see what would be the old Meredith or old Santa Harbor Road, going kind of along where Route 25 is, and then off into a dirt road that's abandoned in about that spot at now, but major early roads. At this time, there were 3 village centers in Meredith. You have Salem Bridge or Meredith Bridge, downtown Laconia. You have the actual village of Meredith on Parade Road. And then you have Meredith Center, where this grist mill is over here. Meredith itself, not really much going on here. Meredith Neck, or New Salem Neck, just forest. As a side note, the boundaries in Meredith changed since this, obviously. In 1855, Meredith Bridge set off from Meredith, and then again, in 1873, a section of Meredith was given to Santa Harbor.
I thought it was stolen. Now, they just mentioned some of the requirements that the Masonian proprietors exacted on settlers who were taking over one of these grants. And the interesting thing about all of this is that, number one, land such as that of Meredith was considered to be of no monetary value until people settled it and made it valuable by clearing land and investing time and effort in creating tillable soil and workable farmsteads and so forth. So the Masonian proprietors initially wanted us to induce people to come to a new settlement, and the best way to do that was to offer land grants for free. And they did. Essentially, the people who became town proprietors under the authority of the Masonian proprietors were given land for free. And secondly, that land could become a town, but it could not become a town under the authority of the Masonian proprietors. They were a bunch of real estate agents. They were private owners of this property, which they were giving away to proposed settlers. The only way in which such a place could become a town would be if it met the requirements that the province of New Hampshire had for a town, and created certain structures and certain facilities that would make it eligible to apply for a town charter. As May said, Meredith didn't really become incorporated as a town until 1768. That's 20 years after it was granted as a township or a piece of land to the private proprietors who received it. So you can see on the screen here some of the requirements that the Masonian proprietors imposed on the private recipients of their land grants. And these were focused on trying to make that tract of land eligible to become incorporated as a town. First of all, you have to build a small house. And by small, you really mean small. You can hardly imagine a full family of husband, wife, and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children, as they tended to have large families, living in the kind of house that was built. And yet, we know from documentary evidence in the Masonian proprietors' papers, most of which are at the state archives, where Brian Burford of last month works and maintains the records. These were generally considered to be houses of about 16 feet square, or 14 by 18 feet in the case of the charter or the grant of Meredith. They had to clear a certain amount of land, and it was a really modest requirement, which is probably appropriate, given that the only tool that the average settler had to clear land was an axe. And essentially, it was a terrifically laborious process. So they had basically to clear 3 acres within 8 years as a minimum amount of clearance here in Meredith in order to maintain ownership of their grant. If they forfeited that, if they failed to do that, then basically the land would revert back to the Masonian proprietors and could be regranted to some other more ambitious private individual. And to continue to improve acreage every year. And this was monitored, and that's how we know a lot about the progressive settlement of the Masonian townships through the records they kept of the land that had been cleared, houses that had been built, the barns that had been built. One of the other things they needed to do, this was very important in order to qualify to become an incorporated town, was to build a meeting house. Now, a meeting house in those days was used largely for town purposes, town meeting purposes, but on the Sabbath it was used for religious purposes, if you had a minister. And so one of the other requirements that was imposed on the settlers of any of these new towns was that they settle, that means hire, a minister, which today seems very strange that a community in a town would employ a minister. But in the 18th century, this was normal, very much like the Church of England essentially is the church, the official church of England still today. It was expected that in New England, every community would decide upon what denomination it wished to employ or what minister of which denomination it wanted to employ. And so the majority, of course, as is common in our New England towns, went to the congregational denomination, although there were some towns in New Hampshire that settled a Baptist minister, and a few others as well, but generally congregational. So until 1819, when there was a legislative separation of church and state, the ministers in our New Hampshire towns were town employees, basically. And another thing that was very important in one of these communities was to, if at all possible, to create a sawmill. When the first houses were built, we know this from the Masonian records, most of them were log cabins, log houses, and they were hewn from the trees that were being felled to clear the land. But everybody aspired not to live in a log house, which tended to be very dark and dirt-floored and often with no chimney and, very, very smoky and dismal places. Everybody wanted a framed house, but you cannot have a framed house until you have boards to enclose the frame with. And so a sawmill was very important, and the first sawmill in Meredith was actually down in what's now Laconia. So it was very important to move in that direction of getting a sawmill and to provide an inducement for a miller, a sawyer, to come to town and to set up a mill. Here's a good example of a meeting house and a burying ground or cemetery adjacent to it. This is down in Danville, New Hampshire, one of the older settled towns in the southeastern part of the state. This is the oldest intact and unadulterated meeting house left in New Hampshire. It dates from 1755, and you can see that adjacent to it is a burying ground, and that's exactly what was expected, both in Masonian townships and even in the earlier ones, that you'd have a burying ground, a meeting house, often a school lot with a public school in the same general location, and a training field, which is the field in which the militia of the period had to train. In the old days, the militia was a required defensive organ of state or provincial government, and the militia was compelled to meet periodically for musters, for training in military maneuvers and so forth. So all of these things tended to be what you would expect at a town center, and they showed you earlier on Parade Road, the location of the old Meredith Town Center. That's exactly what group of facilities was placed there. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about methods by which others in New Hampshire have done what we're going to be talking about tonight and what you are all going to be doing in the near future, and that is exploring and interpreting and understanding and celebrating the richness, the cultural resources of the Page Pond community forest. Other towns have wrestled with town-owned parcels like that in the past, and they have struggled to understand and to preserve these parcels. And one example of that occurred about 22 years ago down in what is now Milford, New Hampshire, where a seemingly unoccupied and empty, featureless field was purchased by a group of real estate developers who proposed to put 28 houses in this field. When that happened, unbeknownst to the neighbors became really disturbed, really frightened, because the neighbors had long realized that this field and the woods that surrounded it were the site of what was called the Lost Village of Monson. The Lost Village of Monson was an abandoned 18th century settlement. It had been settled actually under the authority of Massachusetts before the boundary line was settled as we see it today between Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And people actually began to move here and build houses as far back as 1730. And suddenly it seemed that this area, which had only lasted for about 40 years under occupancy, and then had sort of given up and allowed itself to be absorbed by Amherst, Hollis, and Milford, New Hampshire, and ceased to exist as a town, was going to be covered with 28 houses. Well, now, where was Monson? If we go back to that map of 1761, you see a lot of familiar and a lot of unfamiliar names on this map. And one of the unfamiliar names, now a little more familiar to you, is Monson, right here. This is just above Hollis and just below Souhegan West, which is now Amherst. That's the town that, after 40 years of struggle, became absorbed by the neighboring communities and never was developed further. So this was a tremendously important archaeological site, the one place that had been settled in New Hampshire and then unsettled, so to speak, and was remaining as an artifact to be explored and discovered by the future generations as an unchanged time capsule from the first settlement of the province, or the first earliest settlement of the province. How did they explore their proposed parcel of endangered land? They found a map. This was a map that was drawn at some unknown date by a man named Joseph Blanchard, who was a well-known surveyor. And if you see this map, it's a little bit hard to fathom what it really represents. The reason for that is the draftsmanship is good, but the map was drawn on the hide of an animal. I don't know if it's a lamb skin or a cow skin or whatever it may be, a horse hide, I don't know. But basically, it's a pretty hard map to read. But right up here, running up here, is the Merrimack River. Down here is the Nashua River. And up here is the Souhegan River. So the area we're talking about is right in this area. That map is owned by the New Hampshire Historical Society. And luckily, sometime around 1850, a land surveyor had taken this sort of undecipherable cowhide and had transcribed some of the lots onto paper. And that's what you're seeing on the left-hand screen here. And you can see this is pre-Masonian planning because there are no rectilinear checkerboard layouts of lots. You do have some rows of lots, but you also have lots of irregular things coming in at all different angles. This is characteristic of town planning as it was done in the 1600s in Massachusetts and Connecticut. Over here on the right, that same map is superimposed on a USGS, U.S. Geological Survey quadrangle. So what we did, and by we, I mean people working then in the State Historic Preservation Office who were trying to find a way to preserve the lost village of Monson and prevent those developers from digging it up. We took Mylar and we transcribed, we photocopied, this is primitive stuff compared to today's technology, but we photocopied the transcription of the old 1761, unknown date map onto Mylar, superimposed it at the right scale over USGS quadrangle, which is what you see over here, And amazingly enough, it lined up pretty well. The ponds that are shown in the bottom of these maps lined up with current ponds. And even the USGS maps even showed some stone wall lines. The new ones do in purple ink. And they lined up pretty well too with some of these lot lines in this old map. So what ultimately happened was that the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forests, State Preservation Office, many private individuals got together and basically bought out the developer. And this land became the property of the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forests, which it remains today. But like all Forest Society property, it's available as kind of a public area, and you can basically go into it and wander around. And from the map work that I just described, the local proponents of preservation were able to lay out the lots, to figure out which cellar hole, and there were many cellar holes in this area, belonged to which person. And then this map over on the right is sort of a hand-drawn, homemade little map done by one of the preservation proponents showing who exactly lived where, and how the roads went, where the stone walls were, where the culverts were, and so forth. So this goes to show that the value that is created by this kind of a residual artifact in the landscape, and how threatening it can be when this kind of land is suddenly threatened by development, as this was. And I want to just very quickly mention another example of the same sort of interpretation of what otherwise looks like a featureless landscape. This over here is a USGS, U.S. Geological Survey quadrangle showing Lake Sunapee. And down here at the bottom of Lake Sunapee is a thing called Sunset Hill, which also happens to be a big tract of land owned by the Society for Protection of New Hampshire Forests. Well, some years ago, the Forest Society became interested in trying to interpret the cellar holes, the stone walls, the range lines, the various other things. And by the way, this is in the Masonian area, so it does have a grid layout. And so they began to do somewhat the same kind of research. They basically found a proprietor's map of Sunapee, which then was bigger than it is now, took a piece of that map, photocopied it on a transparent mylar, same primitive technology, superimposed it over a USGS map. It's like this map being superimposed over this map, resulting in that map. And what that has allowed is a full understanding of the various lots in Sunset Hill, this portion of what's now Newbury, New Hampshire, and the creation of a whole lot of field studies, field trips, interpretive ventures of all different kinds to make that otherwise seemingly dead and forested land come alive as a kind of living landscape. Okay, I'm going to turn that back to you.
All right, so back here in Meredith, here is a little bit of a clearer copy of that 1770 Smithsonian map of the original parcels in Meredith. And you can see I've circled the Page Pond area over here. This was in Division 3, and it was the 5th, 6th, and 7th range, and all or most of lots 44, 45, 50, 51, and 60. And the new Page Pond extension is in lot 42, which is, I think that one. So one thing that's interesting with this map is you can't really readily see a lot of these lines on the landscape, but you do have some of the range roads still around. For instance, right between these two lots here is Quarry Road, coming into Page Pond Forest, and then down, I think it's that one, is Blueberry Hill Road, which divided on the dividing lot between the 6th and 7th range. And you can, once you kind of overlay this map on more modern maps, you can really see how those two maps line up, which is kind of interesting. Can I get back over to you, Michelle?
Now, what May just said was basically that we have a range road, now called Quarry Road. You're all familiar with it. And we also have other range lines that exist in the landscape. But what are you looking at here? This looks like one of those photographs of the surface of the moon, right? This is a new technology, and this is going to make it a lot easier for you to do the same sort of thing that the people who are trying to understand and interpret Monson or the people at Lake Sunapee did with USGS maps and Mylar overlays. This is a new technology. This is called LIDAR, which stands for Light Detection and Ranging. LIDAR is actually created by laser radiation that is projected from low-flying aircraft. And these lasers actually penetrate through the vegetation. They penetrate all the way down to bare ground. And they create the kind of an image that you can see here. Now, this is a technology that has been used by planners and surveyors and others for maybe, 10 years or so. But New Hampshire now is just getting the completion of the full range of LIDAR scans of the entire state. I think the last section to be done was the White Mountain area. So suddenly now we have a technology, we have a digital technology that shows the surface of New Hampshire as if no vegetation was growing. Now, all of this became known to me and a few other people maybe 6 months or so ago when Richard Chorman, who's a state geologist, got a grant from the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation to work with the University of New Hampshire and to take this LIDAR data and to put it on a platform that will become available to everybody in this room and everybody in the state, everybody in the world for that matter. A digital platform that will allow any of us to call up any portion of New Hampshire that interests us and to erase the vegetation and see the surface, as you can see here. So here is Quarry Road. This is Route 25. Here is the quarry. We'll tell you a little bit more about that quarry later on. This is down here in the bottom of the map. You can see it looks like a little depression in the landscape. And down at the very bottom is a portion of Page Pond, which is what gives its name to this area. So this is a magical technology, and it allows you to see things. You can see, for example, those of you close enough to the screen can see the plowed and cultivated fields up here right along Quarry Road and Route 25. And you can see a series of stone walls and a variety of other things that we'll talk about later. We've got some other LIDAR scans coming up a little bit later here. But this is a technology that allows us, in our easy chair or wherever we sit when we're looking at a computer, to basically go outdoors and erase the vegetation and see the landscape in a new way. Now what this does is it preserves and presents to us the stone features and other topographic changes that have occurred through cultivation, through European settlement and all the changes that have occurred down to the present. And specifically, the one thing in the landscape that Europeans did when they settled here that has not disappeared has been the stone that they placed for one feature or another. When I worked, May and I both worked at the Division of Historical Resources, State Preservation Office, one of the great issues we had in that office was the theft of stone walls at that time. This was 10, 15 years ago. And we were very concerned about bringing to the public's attention the evocative nature of stone walls and the fact that they not only are evocative as representing a huge amount of labor, but they are also evocative in that they are a physical representation of the surveyor's lines of these grid townships or any other private property line that was bounded by a stone wall. Well, stone walls are not the only stone feature that interests us. We discovered that the public had a very strong, visceral kind of a reaction to these stone features and was very solicitous of their preservation. You can see at the lower left of the screen a nice stone arched culvert. This is over in Temple, New Hampshire. The upper right of the screen shows a stone bridge abutment and dam in Newmarket, New Hampshire, down near the seacoast. And right down at the bottom right, is that big causeway on Meredith Neck Road, which is right next to the cemetery, and many of you probably recognize this picture. So these were all handmade, each one of them made by huge labor, and they are basically the bones of the landscape. They are features that remain with us today and presumably always will be with us. And so this new technology of LIDAR allows us to see these things from an elevation and potentially to understand their presence and protect them, even when they're not visible easily by walking through the woods or flying over in an airplane. Now, one of the things that we mentioned earlier was very important in any new township was the creation of a sawmill. I just want to mention a little bit about the the numbers of these mills that existed, because we're going to be talking about one in just a minute here at Page Pond. This is a good example of one 19th century photograph of a little sawmill on a small brook in Lee, New Hampshire, down by the University of New Hampshire. And in that mill would have been this type of a machine. This is an up and down or reciprocating saw, which was a type of saw that basically, here's the blade of the saw right here, suspended in a wooden frame. And at the bottom of that frame, it's attached to a crank on a water wheel. So that as the water wheel turns, that saw goes up and down and up and down. And every time it comes down, a log is advanced about 1/4 of an inch toward the saw. And so the saw rips through this. And whenever you go into an old building and you look at the old lumber in that building, you will see the parallel saw marks of this type of a sawmill. Well, these mills were in great numbers in New Hampshire, and Page Pond is an example of that, as you will see in just a minute. But I just want to give you a couple of figures that I've gotten from some of the censuses. In 1850, the census enumerates 500, approximately, a little more than 500 of these sawmills existing in New Hampshire. By 1874, that number had increased from 500 to 762. In 1850, these sawmills sawed about 100 million board feet of lumber. By 1874, they sawed 305 million board feet of lumber. 1850, they sawed 30 million shingles, and this is a different type of machine from what I just showed you. It's a circular shingle saw. By 1874, 70 million shingles were being sawn in these mills. 1850, 4 to 5 million clapboards were being cut in these mills. By 1874, 6.5 million clapboards were being cut. So these were highly important in the timber economy of New Hampshire. I'm going to turn it back to Meg. We'll talk about one of these mills.
All right, so as we mentioned earlier, the first sawmill in Meredith was built in 1765 in what is now downtown Laconia, down off the Winnipesaukee River. There was also another early grist mill in what is now Meredith Center from 1767. The Page Pond Mill isn't one of these super early mills, but is a fairly early mill that has a really interesting story if we can figure it out. There's a lot of evidence on the site of what was there as a mill. Then we can also find information looking at the deeds and looking into oral histories. So when you're walking in Page Pond and you come around a corner, this foundation is massive. So it must have been a pretty big operation when it was going. The mill itself was 96 feet long, 16 feet wide, and 18 feet high. And we can see, looking at the stones, that they were split using a technology that dates them to around 1830 or more recently than that. Then we go and we look at the deeds and read that in 1830, James Gilman sold a 1-acre parcel of land on the Fish Brook at the outlet of the Little Pond to Sewell Levitt. And title to this piece of land included what is called mill privileges, so the ability to control the water flow in that outlet right there. Levitt owned a nearby farm on what was Lot 45. This is Lot 51 from the original Smithsonian grant. And the Levitt family, there were a lot of Levitts in that area. It's actually really confusing doing the research because they're all cousins, and but it was Levitt territory. In 1836, just 6 years later, Levitt sold my sawmill and 2.5 acres to John Page for $400. So it was improved land at that point. At that time, when Page owned it, the Fish Brook became the Page Brook. Little Pond became Page Pond. Page didn't live right on this property. He lived a little south of it on what was then called Page Road, which is now Blueberry Hill Road. So we don't really see a lot of evidence, or at least I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't understand the evidence of what the building itself looked like, but we know from the Moulton family and oral histories from them that it was that reciprocating kind of sawmill, which would be typical of the 1830s, and that the log carriage was held in place by two different chains that were tied into the axle of the water wheel. So when the wheel turned, one chain pulled the carriage forward and one pulled it back, and that cut your logs. So during the 1830s and 1840s, a lot of beams for different barns and houses in the area of Meredith Neck were sawn in this mill. So Page operated this mill until 1855, at which time he sold the 2.5 acres and the sawmill to a man named David Roberts, who was a farm laborer, and he only sold it for $250. So at some point, the deed to the property passed from Roberts to James Bickford. And as far as I know, we're not really sure exactly when that happened, but the theory is that Bickford foreclosed on a mortgage to Roberts. And as Jim was just talking about the evolution of sawmills, by the 1860s, circular saws were in other areas in Meredith. And circular saws are a lot more efficient than your reciprocating saw. So this was outdated by that point. And the next transfer of the property in 1879, when it was sold to David Gilman, who was the great-grandson of James Gilman from the 1830s, it was only sold for $15, and there's no building recorded. And there's no building recorded on any subsequent deeds. So, you know, I don't know if it was torn down or if it just kind of got to demolition by neglect, but active about 1830 to 1855-ish. And then, do you want to? I was just going to say these are images Jim added to this, so you can see the aerial image of Page Pond and where the mill is. And then here you can see with the LiDAR how you can see where that dam pops right out.
All right. Well, I just want to build on that same theme about water power, which was so essential. It was the one form of mechanical power that we had in New Hampshire until the advent of the steam engine. And steam engines began to be used in large factories like this one, beginning in the 1870s and so forth. But in undercapitalized or lightly capitalized places, water power remained supreme. But it also remained supreme in other places. And I want to just mention how these somewhat humble beginnings, although I wouldn't call that mill at Page Pond humble by any means. It's an incredibly impressive stone feature in wonderful condition and well worth the trek through the trail that leads into it. But nevertheless, this is small by comparison to what happened beginning in the 1820s and 1830s, especially as we moved from the question of sawing wood to the question of making textiles, which became a tremendous industry in New Hampshire. You know, Amiskay Corporation in Manchester on the Merrimack River was the world's largest textile manufacturing. And so we in New Hampshire became actually preeminent in the manufacturing of textiles. But here's a good example of how important water power was. This is actually the Newmarket cotton factory down in Newmarket, New Hampshire, which is right on Tidewater. This is where the Lamprey River meets the waters of Great Bay. And you can see that the scale of these stone mills is huge, but here you're looking at maybe only about 1/3 of the complex. So this is a tremendous industrial complex built at great expense. But the Lamprey River, by its natural flow, is a relatively small river. It does not have the water power that could be relied upon year-round to power mills of this scale. So what did the corporation do? They basically went up into the country, maybe 20 or 25 miles, found a variety of ponds, dammed them up, made them much bigger, much deeper, much larger in dimensions, and used them as reservoirs. And what you're seeing in the upper left-hand side here is the Bendham's Pond Dam in Barrington, New Hampshire, which was a number of miles upstream in the headwaters of the Lamprey, as a reservoir for the Newmarket woolen mills. Another pond over in that area called Pawtuckaway was originally two ponds. Two dams were built at the two ponds, and they were flowed together into what's now called Pawtuckaway Lake, and that was another reservoir for these mills down in Newmarket. But the Cogeco Manufacturing Company in Dover had its other set of ponds and reservoirs, one of which is one of the most prominent, which is Bow Lake in Stratford. So this was an area where water power was so important that the huge capital investment was made in building these dams and going 20, 25 miles upriver in order to obtain the kind of water power, reliable water power year-round that was needed for these manufacturing processes. Now, May will tell you something local.
Yeah, and forgive me for those of you who have already heard me go on and on about the importance of the Swayze Canal to Meredith. So after 1809, a man named John Von Swayze began to purchase up land along the Measley Brook, Measley Pond Brook, which basically went from Waukee through the lumberyard behind Lang Street School and down into Meredith Bay. There were a couple little mills along there, but he had an idea. So after he purchased all of that land and actually most of what is now the village of Meredith, Mr. Swayze in 1816 began to cut the 600-foot-long Swayze-Waukee Canal from the Long Cove of Waukee through the village to create a concentrated water source at the falls, at what is now Mill Falls. The water power generated from the new Waukee Canal had incredible repercussions on Meredith and the development of the town. I mean, this was huge stuff. The village center emerged as a cotton manufacturing center with various mills along the new canal, and as soon as it was done, Swayze built a new sawmill, a new grist mill, fulling mills, carding mills, everything right at the head of that falls. The population of the town really took off after that. You started as this sweet little hamlet with not much going on, but then all of a sudden there were all these factories, and as the factories grew, they needed workers. As they needed workers, those workers needed housing, and they needed churches, and they needed stores and banks, and therefore Meredith grew up as a result of that. So the population in 1790 was 881. In 1810, before the canal was built, it was 1,940, and then just a few years later, in 1822, Meredith had 5 stores, a tannery, cloth and dressing manufacturing company, 3 lawyers, 1 doctor, and 2,416 people. By 1840, the population was over 3,000. So at a time before there was electricity and motorized engines, having a reliable water source was really important just to keep everything going and keep your mill equipment going forward. In 1859, just a little bit of background on Meredith, the Meredith business community formed the Meredith Mechanics Association to develop the town's potential. And they succeeded in attracting Seneca Ladd's piano factory, at least 1 lumber mill, and we stole Samuel Hodgkin's hosiery manufacturing business from Lakeport in 1876. And they became Meredith's largest employer. The mill, the Hodgson mill, was destroyed in a fire in 1889 and put 160 people out of work. It was rebuilt as the Meredith Linen Mill, and in 1895, the water power from the canal was first used to generate electricity with the Meredith Electric Light Company. So it was a big deal. So shifting gears completely back to that rural landscape, now that we've talked about that, we thought we'd talk a little bit about the Bickford Farm cellar hole itself. It's a great example of a small farming, subsistence farm in New Hampshire, and something that was all over the state. We can see from here, just looking at the foundation itself, I created a little line drawing of what's there, and from that you can start to figure out what the building may have looked like. Again, you see this is a slab of granite, and you can see how it was split, and that type of technology we're probably not going to really get to go into tonight because we don't have enough time, but shows that it was built 1830 or more recently, so post-1830, which coincides with the time when agricultural production was really taking off in the state of New Hampshire, which we'll talk about some more. Again, we have an aerial view of the Bickford Farm area, and then the LiDAR, which shows there's your cemetery, there's your cellar hole right there, and there is a cemetery there as well. And then I just threw this up here because from looking at that cellar hole, you kind of get an idea of what the building may have looked like. And this is just an example of kind of your average little cape from 1830. And you have your big center chimney that you can see the center chimney base there, and your front stoop under the front door, and it's about the right proportions. At the Bickford Farm site, we also know that there was a large barn attached to the right side of the house with a potential privy along the east wall and another larger detached barn across a small yard. So who lived there? We can look at deeds, census records, mortality schedules, and maps to help decipher the story of who lived at the Bickford Farm site. A lot of research on this has been done by other local historians, so I'm not going to really have time to go into too much of it. But before 1805, the property was sold to a member of the Levitt family. And the Levitt family stayed there until about 1830-ish, 1830s. An 1831 deed from John Batchelder to Obadiah Currier, does list the buildings being there. So probably about 1830 for the house there. It was known as the Elijah Smith Farm between 1832 and 1852. And then in 1852, it became the Bickford Family Farm, and they stayed there until 1931 when it was sold to Lewis Cowley.
Question?
Yeah.
Is that where the village of Winnipesaukee is now, that property?
This is,
On Route 25?
no, this property is, well, it's kind of off Barnard Ridge Road, and it's, I go back. This is Barnard Ridge Road. So there's some fields, and it's like really in the middle of the woods now. So it's here, and this is Page Pond. So the sawmill site's about here, and this is Quarry Road coming in.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this building was built during the agricultural peak in New Hampshire, which was between 1830 and about 1880, when forest clearing and agricultural activity really took off in the state. The population grew, and there were a lot of self-sufficient farms like the Bickford property. Also, during this period, we wanted to mention stone walls everywhere. After 1809 and the invasion of Spain by Napoleon Bonaparte, Merino sheep took off in the U.S. They were brought back to Vermont by an American diplomat named William Jarvis. At the same time, we were at war with England in the War of 1812 and started having all these trade problems with Britain, so we needed to produce our own cloth. And we had these great sheep. So a lot of farmers really got into raising sheep, which do really well on our rocky and not very tillable land. So during this period, a lot of those big mills were made to process the wool, but then also we built a lot of stone walls that aren't necessarily along property lines. And this is, I suspect that's what this wall was, just in the woods behind my own house. For just a little bit of information on how many sheep were in New Hampshire, in 1836 there were 465,000 sheep in New Hampshire. In Meredith in 1840, that was 3,826 sheep. and there were only 3,351 people. So at the time, Meredith probably looked more like Wales than Meredith. But the sheep craze was pretty short-lived. With westward expansion and easier ways to farm, a lot of the population went west. So, and as this happened, the economy of this area went from production to more factory work, and then eventually tourism.
And to build on that sad note, this is an example of a huge social problem that occurred in New Hampshire in the late 1800s, and that was farm abandonment. This was a period when, as just said, that young people tended to move to the factories or tended to move west where they had better land, rock-free land. And what happened to the farms? The farms were left in the hands of the older generation, maybe an older couple and a couple of hired men. And essentially, as these people aged still further, they couldn't maintain that land. And so what had once been 80% cleared land in New Hampshire began to revert to forest, to the point that New Hampshire is now about 80% forested land. And what we see here is kind of a sad picture from the New Hampshire Historical Society in the upper left of one sad and undernourished elderly gentleman with a flock of about 10 sheep on really overgrazed pasture. You see there's no grass visible in that picture. And beyond the stone wall, a cornfield with a bunch of shocks of corn all stacked up, but obviously not growing corn on a marketable basis, just a subsistence basis. And in the lower right-hand corner of this slide, you see an abandoned house, an abandoned farm. There were thousands of abandoned farms in New Hampshire by the late 1800s, so much so that the state of New Hampshire actually, the Department of Agriculture, appointed a commissioner of immigration to try to get people to come to New Hampshire and buy up these farms, which had been abandoned. Essentially what you did, if you couldn't farm anymore, you couldn't pay taxes on your property, you walked away. You left the door unlocked and you walked away, found some way of subsisting. So New Hampshire was riddled with these, and what did this do to the town's economies? Just as presently, property taxes paid a great deal of the revenue of any community. And when your farms began to be abandoned, taxes ceased to be paid. Your property tax revenue went down to nearly nothing in many cases. So this was a huge problem, and it was also a psychological problem because New Hampshire, like all of New England, had thought of itself from the 1600s as an agricultural economy. And when suddenly our whole agricultural way of life dissipated and faded away, this was psychologically very damaging to the people of New England. There's a huge amount of literature in the late 1800s about the abandoned farm problem. And I'm not going to belabor that, but it basically ties into what happened to the landscape throughout New Hampshire, including that in the Page Pond area, the Bickford Farm area. It ceased basically to be husbanded. It became abandoned. And as you see in this set of pictures, a progressive statement of what happens to land after it ceases to be farmed. You move from, this is relatively late, it happened a lot earlier in many cases, from 1900 of tilled farmland through a progressive influx of grass, berries, birch and junipers, the pioneering trees that come up in old pastures, to the more shade-tolerant trees like oaks. So between 1900 and 1910, you had an uncultivatable landscape. And you move up to 1940, and you have essentially a forested landscape. And this brings up that anomaly that is often remarked upon by people from outside of New England. When they come here and find stone walls through the woods, why would anybody build a stone wall in the woods? Well, they didn't. I mean, this was all open land and under good cultivation. The woods came later. The woods were there first, disappeared, came back, which they do in New England, as you all know.
So what did this mean for Bickford Farm? Well, in 1931, Roy Bickford sold the homestead to Louis Philip Caverly, who had formerly lived on Walking Lawn Street in Meredith. He was a farmer, and there's evidence that he made some upgrades to the property. There's evidence of electricity having gone to the house, of running water, and repairs in the basement. that you can see with some more modern mortar in there. In 1940, according to the census records, he lived on the farm, which was still operational, with his wife and 2 farmhands. By 1958, however, when he died, he was no longer living there. So I'm not sure if other people have figured out the dates more specifically, but sometime between 1940 and 1958, the place was abandoned. And Jim actually discovered this when we were out walking there. There's evidence with some of the granite that it was subject to very high heat, so there's the possibility that there was a fire there, and that's what happened to the Bickford farm. You know, I don't know if I didn't have time to do all the research myself, but I'm sure someone can find, you know, that newspaper article that says what happened, if that is indeed what happened. But that's not quite the end of the story for the piece of property, and we're almost done. But the now abandoned quarry at the end of Quarry Road was originally settled by Dudley and Judith Levitt, or that area was, in 1806. Levitt was, Dudley Levitt, excuse me, was very famous in his own right. And I don't think we're really going to have time to go into that unless Jim has it planned. That was a whole other topic. His original farmhouse is actually, it was moved in about 1825 into what is now Santa Harbor, but was in 1825, Meredith, along Route 25 on the way into Santa Harbor Village. But his great-great-grandson, Dudley Levitt, also, just to be confusing, was the last Levitt to live in their homestead with his Aunt Hulda and his sisters Mary Alice and Marion. He was a very active farmer, involved in the Winnipesaukee Grange, and a breeder of oxen. So he lived there in the 1920s, and it was then that they discovered trap rock underlying the land to the south of the cemetery. Trap rock is a dark igneous rock with high levels of iron and magnesium and low levels of silica. So it's very useful for building up roads and railroad beds because of its high resistance to mechanical stress and frost. And so in the early 20th century, as road building was really taking off, Levitt quarried the land, crushed the rock on site, and transported it from the area on Quarry Road. And the Levitt family owned the property until 1920, when it was operated by the New Hampshire Department of Transportation for several years. And then in 1945, it went back into private ownership and was later abandoned.
Trap rock, that's what you just heard about. Nice lecture on trap rock. But trap rock is pretty rare in New Hampshire. This is a type of stone that is perfect for what a highway person calls road metal. That's the kind of stone you today bind with asphalt and use as the stone in your pavement in a highway. This was actually a rather rare and important discovery on this piece of land, something other than granite, this other type of material. And this happened to coincide with a great reformation in highway building in New Hampshire. By the late 1800s, we had a movement, I'm not going to go into great depth on this, but it was called the Good Roads Movement. And it was an effort to take the muddy and in the summertime, very dusty roads of New Hampshire and transform them into a highway system, not for automobiles, it hadn't arrived yet, but for more economical transportation of farm goods to market. This would have been by horses. Teams of horses can pull a much larger load over a good road than they can over a soft, especially over a muddy road. And so the improvement of highways began to be a matter of concern to state government and even to what is now the University of New Hampshire. What you're seeing on the screen here is a set of photographs of experiments that occurred at the College of Agriculture and Mechanic Arts, which is now the University of New Hampshire, in Durham, in 1895, when the college itself, being an agricultural college, experimented and did a demonstration on road building. And what you see in the left-hand photograph is the best way to under-drain a highway. And that is to put in what they called a Telford base. Telford was a Scottish road engineer in the 1700s who pointed out the benefit of under-draining a highway by laying a pavement of boulders like you see here. And then on top of that under surface of boulders, you place a surface of crushed stone, which was called then macadam, for another Scottish road engineer who wrote and theorized in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Macadam, as you see it laid here in the main street of Durham in 1895, was waterbound. It was just laid down and rolled and consolidated with water. We didn't get the asphalt addition to it that we are familiar with today that creates what we call tarmac. That didn't occur until the age of the automobile. But nevertheless, a macadamized road like the one you see in the lower right was the state-of-the-art for horse-drawn traffic and allowed much greater freight tonnage to be carried than otherwise would have been possible. And then there was new machinery being added to the range of resources of highway engineers. In the upper left, you're basically seeing a set of 3 machines. One is out of the picture. Over outside the picture here is a steam traction engine, which is providing power, just like a power takeoff on a modern tractor. And that power is being carried by a leather belt down to this, which is pretty inexplicable, but that is a rock crusher. And a rock crusher, well, there's several kinds, but this kind has a set of V-shaped jaws that keep moving back and forth, and the rocks are dropped into the top, and as the jaws keep cracking them, the rocks drop down into the V of the crusher and come out as macadam at the bottom. And that then is carried by a conveyor belt, also run by that traction engine, up into the gravel sorter, which is this big container over here, and then sorted into different finenesses of gravel, which then are dumped out from the hoppers into wagons, like this one, to be carried off and laid down as road pavement. And the finishing touch of all of this is that great machine you see in the lower right. That is a steam road roller. We call them steam rollers today, or we shouldn't call them that. They're no longer steam powered, but there's a steam powered one. They could weigh up to 20 tons, and when a machine like that slowly moved its way down the road, it crushed that macadam into a very good pavement surface, even without the binding of asphalt. And so this is what that trap rock quarry did. It provided the raw material for this kind of road building. And once the automobile began to be predominant after about 1910, 1915, the high speed of the automobile required even better highways and all kinds of experiments. And again, we don't have time to go into all of that. But that trap rock quarry would have been of essential importance in building Route 25 and who knows how many other roads in the neighborhood. So this brings us to the end, basically, of this quick narrative, quick summary, although it's a BBC quick tonight, but still, in 1 hour, we've only just touched upon some of the benefits of this publicly owned land. And what you're seeing right here is one more final LiDAR view showing a little rectangle in the landscape, which is somewhat inexplicable unless you were in that neighborhood and went to see what it is. And what it is the Levitt family cemetery that you see up here in the upper right-hand corner, which is the resting place of Dudley Levitt, the greatest genius probably who ever lived in Meredith, not to offend any current geniuses who live in Meredith, but he was a teacher, a politician, most importantly, a farmer, and still more importantly, an almanac maker who had mathematical ability of really a genius level. So he was able to compile almanacs, to predict eclipses, to do all that an almanac could do from the simple power of his mind. And so you see this very evocative, very quizzical portrait, which is at the New Hampshire Historical Society, sort of summing up his presence in this landscape. And so we have everything. We have abandoned farms, we have sawmills, we have cemeteries, we have agricultural land and stone walls, and we have Dudley Levitt, all in this town-owned parcel. That brings us to the end, so thank you.
I just wanted to thank Jim and May, and as a token of our appreciation, I want to give you each a copy of this publication, Meredith's 250th. It's a great photo album taking you through the town's history that's been developed by the Historical Society in cooperation with a lot of other folks working on the town celebration. So we wanted to give you each a copy and say thank you very much.